Hello. On today's episode of The Weird Stuff, we'll be looking at this. Hello, Corey from CM Images Photography here. If you stuck with me this long, congratulations, because that was bizarre. Today, we're going to be looking at this thing here. We have an extension bellows set from Fotodiox. This is something you'd normally use for macro photography to basically turn any lens you have into a macro lens. It works kind of the same principle as extension tubes would. It's designed to move your lens a bit further away from the body to increase the magnification of the lens. Now the trade-off obviously is you lose the ability to focus to infinity, but if you're trying to take a photo of a bee, you don't want that anyways. It's available in pretty much every mount system for your camera, so whether you shoot Canon, Sony, Olympus, doesn't matter. You can get one for your camera. Now, what does it offer you? First, let's go over what it doesn't offer you. It's a much easier list. No electronic contacts, which means no autofocus, no aperture control, basically no electronic control over your lens of any kind. But there's something else it doesn't offer you. It doesn't offer your spouse grounds for divorce. Because unlike the other one on the market made by NovaFlex, which costs about $1,000 to give you those electronic contacts, this thing's only 50 bucks. So keep that in mind every time I say something bad about it. It's only 50 bucks. Now to start off with, I think I should mention one of the first things I noticed about this when I was using it. So here I am wandering through the botanical gardens, and suddenly I feel, I'm holding it in my hand, and suddenly I feel something fall off. There's this little cap nut in here. What that does is, I don't know what it does, but at random times, this little piece here is just gonna fall off. Fortunately, I've been able to find it every single time. It's probably a generic one that I could replace if I had to, but it's annoying. But 50 bucks. Now, the screw that it's attached to is part of this adjustment knob here, which actually is very smooth. I don't feel really much in the way of vibration or any tension or anything when I use it. This is what you use to modify the extension of the bellows, if you want more or less extension. Now, obviously it doesn't hold on its own, which is what this little screw here is for. The lock holds pretty well, so you don't have to worry about really any kind of equivalent of zoom creep. We'll call it extension creep. It's not made too poorly, I have to say. You got metal mounts on the front and back. I'm sure you've seen a lot of kit lenses that actually have cheap plastic mounts. This one's metal. It's fairly sturdy in your hands, but I have noticed maybe a little bit of flex up here when you have a heavier lens, like a 105mm macro one here. And it doesn't absorb vibrations that well. So when you adjust it and then you push the shutter button on your camera, you may notice a little bit of wobble from that. The best thing to do in that case is simply put your camera on your 10-second delay, and that'll help eliminate any vibrations. Attaching it to your tripod isn't that difficult, but depending on the length of the screw in your tripod plate, it might be a bit difficult at first. When I first got this thing, it looked like this screw here comes off and this stand comes off, but it was so tight that I wasn't quite sure and I didn't want to force it to break it. I did initially try to get my tripod plate in here like this, but you can see obviously there's some gap there and I had some trouble getting the screw to fit properly. Finally, I was able to realize that yes, this piece does come off. And then you can just put this back in here. And then yes, your tripod plate will in fact fit, no problem. But again, you do have to worry about the slight instability with vibration. You got to do something to take care of that. Another problem that I found with this whole mechanism here, the screw is not flush with the foot. So if you use one of those macro sliding plates that's designed to be able to allow you to move the whole setup backward and forward for focusing, so you don't have to adjust focus of the lens to change which would change your magnification, your plate sits at an angle, puts a little bit of tension there, and you might have to make some adjustments, maybe put a few washers in here to raise the height so it sits perfectly flush. So let's talk about how you would actually use this kind of thing. Basically what it does, like extension tubes, it goes between the body and the lens. But unlike extension tubes, which are fixed lengths, and usually when you buy them they come in sets and you get maybe up to like 30 or 40 millimeters of extension total, this gives you up to 150 millimeters of extension. Now the general rule of thumb is whatever the focal length of your lens is, give it that much extension and you've got 1-to-1 macro. Give it more extension than that and you start to increase your magnification. So depending on your lens setup, you can maybe get 2 or 3 times magnification. But this is a bit more effective with longer lenses than shorter ones, because the shorter the lens, the closer you need to be. And it could technically be possible that to focus properly, your point of focus is inside the lens, which means it obviously doesn't work. So just as an example, we've got an 85 millimeter lens on here. And that means if we want 1-to-1 magnification, we're going to give it about 85 millimeters worth of extension, which is roughly here. Got our coin here. So, there we go. We are now focused. Let's take a shot and see what we get, shall we? All right. So, we just shot a photo of this coin at 1-to-1 magnification. Now, you'll notice from the photo that it's not completely sharp. That's because the closer you get to something, the more shallow your depth of field gets. And when you start getting down to these magnifications, the depth of field gets really thin, like millimeters. Especially when you shoot with a lens like this that wide open is f1.8. Now, you remember when I said in the beginning you have no aperture control over here? Which means this lens is going to be shooting at f1.8. Unless you use a little trick to change that. What you can do, take the bellows off, take the lens off, put it on the camera. You can set your camera to the aperture you want. Let's say f8. Now you do a little bit of finger gymnastics. You hold down your depth of field button to lock down the aperture. While that's closed, you also take off the lens. Now this lens is locked down at f8. So, we can put the bellows back on. Put the lens on. Crank up the ISO to compensate because I don't want to shoot it at like a 20th of a second. And let's see what we get. Yeah, a little more depth of field there. Still not covering the entire coin, but it's a lot more than we had before. So that's a simple way that you can get aperture control using kind of a roundabout method, even though the bellows doesn't allow you to have aperture control. I just wouldn't recommend doing this in a very dusty environment. There's one more thing you have to take into account as well, and that's not unique to these bellows. It's with any kind of extension, whether it's a different brand of macro bellows or you're using extension tubes. The more extension you give, the more light you lose. Because effectively your light source, we can say, which is the front of the lens, is being moved farther and farther away. So you've got to compensate for that. Usually your light meter will take that into account, but it's something you need to keep in mind when you're doing macro. The more extension you have, the more light you lose. So what would you use something like this for in a practical sense? Well, obviously you can shoot small objects like coins and things like that. It's also very useful in nature. You can shoot insects as long as they're the kind that let you get close. And you can also use it for shooting flowers. But I'm going to warn you, once you get much beyond 1-to-1, 2-to-1 magnification with flowers, you'll realize they have very dirty minds and they're not afraid to show it. So now let's go over the pros and cons of using something like this. It's cheap. If you want to look into macro photography, this thing's only going to set you back 50 bucks. It's more versatile as a single unit than buying extension tubes because you can vary the length of the extension. With tubes, if you want to get more extension, you have to keep stacking them one on top of the other, and each time you do that, you're adding another joint in the process, which gives another stress point that could potentially cause damage down the road. It's not that heavy, so it doesn't add that much weight to your setup, and it's easy to carry around in a bag. It's 50 bucks. You can only get so much in terms of high quality construction on a $50 piece. It's a little bulky. You're going to have to make some odd room in your bag to fit something like this. It's fully, completely 100% manual. You have no electronic contacts, which means no control over your lens through the body at all. So all things considered, especially given how inexpensive this thing is, it's only $50. If you want to get into macro photography and you don't want to spend $500, $600, $800 or more on a dedicated macro lens, this is a really good way to do it. You can take any lens you have, turn it into a macro lens, and off you go. So that's it for today. If you want to see me do a video on macro photography, more about macro, or if you think my intro was worthy of an Oscar, feel free to put that in the comments below and let me know.